The spray gun felt heavy in her hands, heavier than it should have been for an 18-year-old girl who'd already carried more weight than most people bear in a lifetime. It was June 1944, and Norma Jeane Baker was just another anonymous brunette on the assembly line at Radio Plane Company in Van Nuys, painting target drones for the war effort at $3 a day. She'd been in 11 different homes before she turned 16, married at 16 to escape the 12th, working in a factory at 18 because her husband shipped off to war and someone had to pay the rent. This was supposed to be her life, invisible, unremarkable, forgotten before she was even remembered. Then David Conover walked onto that factory floor with his camera, and everything changed. Or did it? Because when that photographer looked at Norma Jeane and said, "You should be a model," he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing what she could become, what they could make her become. And Norma Jeane, desperate to be seen, to matter, to exist in a world that had spent her entire childhood teaching her she was disposable. She said, yes. That single word would transform her into the most recognizable woman on earth. It would also destroy her completely. This is the story of 7 stages of that destruction, each one disguised as opportunity, each one stripping away another layer of the girl who just wanted someone, anyone, to remember her name. Before we dive deeper into this untold journey, if stories like this fascinate you, the hidden truths behind Hollywood's most iconic figures, make sure to subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. To understand how Norma Jeane learned to kill herself, you have to go back to the beginning, to a place where identity was already a luxury she couldn't afford. Born Norma Jeane Mortensen on June 1st, 1926, she entered the world already unwanted, already a question mark. Her birth certificate listed her father as Martin Edward Mortensen, but her mother Gladys knew the truth. The real father was Stanley Gifford, a co-worker who wanted nothing to do with their affair's consequences. Before Norma Jeane could even speak, she'd learned the first brutal lesson of her existence. Some people are born to be forgotten. Her mother worked as a film cutter at Consolidated Film Industries, splicing together movies frame by frame, creating illusions for audiences who would never know her name. That proximity to fantasy without access to it would drive Gladys slowly, inexorably mad. By the time Norma Jeane was 7, her mother had been committed to Metropolitan State Hospital with paranoid schizophrenia. The last thing Gladys said to her daughter before the men in white coats took her away was strange, almost prophetic. Don't let them change who you are. But Norma Jeane was already learning that who you are is less important than who people need you to be. What followed was systematic erasure. 11 different foster homes, each one teaching Norma Jeane a different version of survival. In one home, she learned to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to become a ghost in her own body. In another, she learned that affection was conditional, that love was something you earned through perfect behavior. She spent time at the Los Angeles Orphans Home Society, where children wore identical uniforms and walked in straight lines. Norma Jeane would later tell a reporter that she used to stand at the orphanage window and watch other children get adopted, watch families choose everyone but her, and each time it happened, a little more of her disappeared. By 12 years old, she'd learned the most dangerous skill a child can learn: how to be whoever people wanted her to be. Her authentic self had become a locked room inside her own mind, a place she visited less and less because going there hurt too much. This was the first stage of her destruction, learning that survival meant performance, that identity was negotiable, that the real Norma Jeane was less valuable than whatever version kept her fed and housed. At 16, Norma Jeane married James Dougherty, a 20-year-old neighbor who seemed like a ticket out of the foster system. This wasn't a love story. It was survival math. Her guardian, Grace McKee, had explained with brutal clarity, either Norma Jeane got married or she went back to the orphanage. On June 19, 1942, she walked down the aisle in a borrowed white dress, looking at a future she'd chosen only because it seemed less terrifying than the alternative. James expected what most men of his generation expected. A wife who cooked and cleaned and asked no questions about her own dreams. Norma Jeane played the role because that's what she did. She played roles. But at night, she'd lie awake, wondering if she'd escaped the foster homes, only to trap herself in a different kind of cage. When James enlisted in the Merchant Marines in 1943 and shipped out, Norma Jeane felt something unexpected: relief. His absence gave her something she'd never had before: space to figure out who she was without performing for someone else's expectations. That's when she took the job at Radio Plane, assembling drones with other women whose husbands had gone to war. For the first time in her life, Norma Jeane was being seen for something she could do, not just for how well she could disappear. David Conover walked onto the factory floor in June 1944 with a camera and a mission, documenting women's war contributions for military morale campaigns. When he spotted Norma Jeane on the assembly line, something clicked. It wasn't just that she was attractive. It was something in the way she moved, the way she looked up when she noticed the camera. There was a hunger there that read as charisma through the lens. He said the words that would change everything. "You should be a model." Norma Jeane said yes, immediately. Not because she understood modeling, but because she wanted to be seen, to matter, to have proof she existed. When the camera focused on her, something magical happened. The shy factory worker disappeared, and someone else emerged. Confident, present, visible. The photographs were published in military magazines, and suddenly thousands of people were seeing Norma Jeane's face. When Emmeline Snively of Blue Book Model Agency saw those photographs and invited her to sign, the trap snapped shut. Snively was blunt. Norma Jeane had potential, but she needed changes. Her brown hair was too ordinary. It needed to be platinum blonde. Her smile was too gummy. She'd need to learn facial control. Most devastatingly, Norma Jeane Dougherty wasn't a name anyone could remember. She'd need something more glamorous. Each change seemed small, logical even. What's wrong with blonde hair if it photographs better? But taken together, these changes weren't enhancement. They were erasure. With every modification, a piece of Norma Jeane Baker disappeared, replaced by the prototype of what would become Marilyn Monroe. By 1946, when 20th Century Fox offered her a contract for $75 a week, Norma Jeane had learned to think of herself as raw material rather than a finished person. What she didn't understand was that $75 a week was the price tag on her entire existence. The studio now owned her name, her image, her time, her body, her choices. The meeting that finalized her transformation happened in a windowless office at Fox in 1946. Casting director Ben Lyon asked the question that would split her identity in two. How do you feel about changing your name? Norma Jeane's stomach dropped. Her name was the last thing connecting her to herself, to the little girl who'd survived 11 homes and 2 orphanages. But Lyon explained that Norma Jeane Baker didn't sound like a star. He suggested Marilyn, after Broadway star Marilyn Miller. For the last name, he asked about family names. She thought about her mother, locked in an institution, about her grandmother, also institutionalized. Then she remembered her mother's maiden name, Monroe. "How about Marilyn Monroe?" Lyon asked. Norma Jeane felt something crack inside her chest, a clean break that didn't hurt yet, but would later. She said yes. And just like that, Norma Jeane Baker Dougherty died on paper. She was 20 years old. Contracts were drawn up in Marilyn Monroe's name. Photographs were labeled Marilyn Monroe. When reporters called, they asked for Marilyn Monroe. And Norma Jeane became a ghost, haunting the body of a woman who didn't yet exist. But names are powerful. When someone calls you by a different name every day, when you sign documents in a name that isn't yours, something happens to your sense of self. You start to fracture. Marilyn Monroe learned to walk differently than Norma Jeane had walked, hips swaying in exaggerated femininity. Marilyn learned to talk differently, that breathy, childlike whisper that made men lean closer. Marilyn learned to smile differently, to hold her face in ways the camera read as seductive. The studio's grooming was thorough and unrelenting. Acting coaches, voice coaches, dance coaches, makeup artists spending hours teaching her the architecture of her new face. She bleached her hair every few weeks until it became brittle and damaged, but platinum blonde was non-negotiable. She underwent electrolysis to reshape her hairline. The woman staring back from magazine covers looked nothing like the brunette factory worker from 2 years earlier. And slowly, Norma Jeane's voice inside her head grew quieter. It was easier to be Marilyn. Marilyn knew what to do. Norma Jeane was just scared all the time. There's a photograph of Marilyn from 1949, taken by Tom Kelly. She's lying on red velvet, completely nude, her body arched in a pose both innocent and provocative. The photograph became iconic, one of the most famous nude images of the 20th century. But what most people don't know is why she agreed to pose. Marilyn needed $50. Her rent was overdue, her car payment late, and the studio had dropped her contract. She called Kelly and asked for modeling work. He offered the nude shoot for $50. She said yes, because $50 meant she wouldn't be evicted. When the photograph surfaced in 1952, after she'd achieved stardom, studio executives panicked. They told her to deny it. But Marilyn did something unexpected. She admitted it. "Yes, that's me. I needed the money for rent." The honesty made her more sympathetic. But that photograph represented something darker, the fundamental transaction at Hollywood's heart. Your body is currency. Your privacy is negotiable. Your dignity has a price tag. The calendar shoot was one transaction in a long series that defined Marilyn's rise. The casting couch was an open secret in the 1940s Hollywood, and Marilyn had to navigate it. She rarely spoke about these experiences in detail, but in unguarded interviews, she'd allude to them. "Hollywood is a place where they'll pay you $1,000 for a kiss and 50 cents for your soul," she said once, more bitterly. "If you're a girl in Hollywood and you want to work, your body doesn't belong to you." The specifics have been lost or buried, but we know powerful men operated with impunity. Joseph Schenck, in his 70s, began a relationship with Marilyn in her early 20s. Harry Cohn offered contracts on condition of private meetings. Johnny Hyde, the agent who helped launch her career, fell in love and used his connections. But that help came with expectations. Each transaction chipped away at something essential. Each time she smiled through meetings that made her skin crawl. The distance between who she was and who she pretended to be grew wider. By 1955, Marilyn Monroe was a star, but she felt empty. The roles were variations on one character, the dumb blonde, the sex symbol. Nobody asked her to act, just to be a cartoon version of sexuality. So Marilyn did something radical. She walked away from Hollywood and moved to New York, enrolling at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg. Method acting was different from anything she'd encountered. It wasn't about hitting marks. It was about truth, authenticity, emotional honesty. Strasberg taught students to draw on their own experiences, their own traumas, to create genuine emotion. For Marilyn, who'd spent her life running from her past, this was revolutionary and devastating. Strasberg saw in them something nobody else had: real talent. He told her she could be a serious actress, that she had depth Hollywood was wasting. For someone told her only value was appearance, this validation was intoxicating. She became devoted to him almost worshipfully, spending hours in class, digging into her past, crying through emotional memories she'd tried to bury. The method required her to access painful experiences and channel them into performances. So, Marilyn revisited childhood abandonment, foster homes, fears of being unwanted. She excavated these traumas repeatedly, like reopening wounds that never healed. Her performances became more nuanced, vulnerable, real. But there was a cost. Each time she dug into painful memories, she destabilized herself a little more. The careful compartmentalization between Marilyn the persona and Norma Jeane the scared girl broke down. She couldn't tell any more when she was performing and when she was being herself. Strasberg's wife Paula became her acting coach, accompanying her to every set, standing off camera during takes. This support created psychological dependency. Marilyn couldn't perform without Paula there, couldn't trust her instincts without Strasberg's validation. In seeking to find her true self through method acting, she'd actually given away even more of herself, outsourcing her emotional life to a teacher who profited from her dependency. When Marilyn died in 1962, she'd left most of her estate to Lee Strasberg, ultimate proof of how completely she'd lost any sense of self-worth, independent of external validation. The pills started innocuously. A doctor prescribed Nembutal for anxiety. Another prescribed Seconal for insomnia. A third prescribed chloral hydrate for nights when the others weren't enough. By 1960, Marilyn was seeing multiple doctors simultaneously, each writing prescriptions without knowing what others had prescribed. She was consuming 20 to 30 pills daily. The pills helped at first, quieting constant anxiety, helping her sleep. But medication that starts as solution becomes its own problem. Pills that helped her sleep made her foggy during the day. Pills that calmed anxiety made her memory unreliable. She'd forget lines on set, appointments, entire conversations. Directors called her difficult, unprofessional, unemployable. The truth was, Marilyn was drowning, and the pills were the water. Her marriage to Arthur Miller was disintegrating under the weight of her insecurities. Her affair with President Kennedy was Hollywood's worst-kept secret, a dangerous entanglement putting her in crosshairs of people far more powerful than studio executives. On May 19, 1962, Marilyn appeared at Madison Square Garden to sing "Happy Birthday" to Kennedy. She wore a dress so tight she had to be sewn into it, so sheer it appeared she wore nothing. Her performance was breathy, suggestive, instantly iconic. But nobody saw what happened before. The pills to calm nerves, the terror in her eyes, how she had to be physically pushed toward the stage. and nobody saw what happened after, when applause died and spotlight moved on, and Marilyn realized she'd performed her sexuality for the entire world, including the man she'd hoped might love her, and all she'd gotten was a laugh. The Kennedy affair ended shortly after with silence, calls unreturned, access denied. By summer 1962, Marilyn was in free fall. Fired from Something's Got to Give after repeated absences, her Hollywood reputation destroyed, deeply in debt despite fame, isolated, with few real friends. Taking more pills than ever, mixing barbiturates and alcohol in terrifying combinations. The last months were marked by desperate reinvention attempts. She gave her last interview to Life magazine in July 1962, weeks before death. She was surprisingly candid about struggles, loneliness, the sense Hollywood had used her up. "I'm trying to find myself," she told the journalist, "as a person, as an actress, as everything. But nobody lets you find yourself. They're always telling you who you should be." It read like a goodbye letter. On August 4th, she spent the day making phone calls to her psychiatrist, to friends, to Peter Lawford. In final conversations, she sounded alternately drugged and anxious, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused. Around 7:30 p.m., Dr. Greenson came to her house, staying several hours before leaving around 7:15 p.m. Sometime between then and 3:40 a.m., Marilyn Monroe took her last pills. Whether she intended them to be fatal, or whether it was accidental overdose from misjudged tolerance, we'll never know. A woman who'd spent her entire life trying to be seen, who'd transformed from invisible orphan to global icon to avoid being forgotten, died alone in a locked room. When they found her body at 3:40 a.m., the police report described Marilyn Monroe, age 36, found in her bedroom, lying face down, naked except for a sheet, hand still clutching the telephone. Official cause: acute barbiturate poisoning, probable suicide. But which person had died? Marilyn Monroe, the platinum goddess, or Norma Jeane Baker, the scared foster kid? The answer is both and neither, because by 1962 there was no meaningful separation anymore. The line between real person and performed persona had dissolved so completely. There was just a woman who didn't know who she was, who'd been so many versions of herself for so many people that she'd lost track of which was true. Marilyn Monroe's tragedy isn't just that she died young. It's that she spent her entire adult life killing who she actually was to become who everyone else wanted her to be. When she finally succeeded, when Marilyn Monroe was famous enough that everyone knew her name and face, Norma Jeane was already gone. Nobody remembered her. Nobody even knew to mourn her. The world mourned Marilyn Monroe. 50,000 people lined up to view her body. Joe DiMaggio arranged the service, banning most of Hollywood, and had red roses delivered to her grave 3 times weekly for 20 years. But who mourned Norma Jeane? Who grieved for the little girl at the orphanage window? The teenager who married at 16 to avoid homelessness? The factory worker who just wanted someone to see her? Nobody. Because by the time the world fell in love with Marilyn Monroe, Norma Jeane Baker had been dead for years. Her erasure was so complete that even in death she was invisible. The final erasure, ultimate proof the transformation was complete. She'd succeeded in becoming Marilyn Monroe. The cost was just everything she'd actually been. Decades after death, Marilyn Monroe remains one of history's most recognizable figures. Her image reproduced millions of times. Posters, T-shirts, art, film. The white dress billowing over the subway grate is one of the 20th century's most iconic images. She is, in every sense, immortal. But who is the Marilyn we've immortalized? The real woman. Norma Jeane Baker, foster kid, survivor, reader, thinker, someone who struggled with mental health and addiction and impossible pressures. Or the fantasy. Platinum blonde, sex symbol, breathless child woman existing only to fulfill male desire. We've mostly immortalized the fantasy. We've preserved exactly the version Norma Jeane had to create to survive. The performance she maintained at cost of her authentic self. In doing so, we've completed Hollywood's erasure, ensuring Norma Jeane stays dead while Marilyn Monroe lives forever, in a form she would have found suffocating. Let's return to 1949, when Marilyn needed $50 for rent and agreed to pose nude for Tom Kelly. That transaction encapsulates everything: the desperation, the survival calculation, how her body became currency in an economy with no interest in her soul. $50 to avoid eviction. That's the price at which dignity became negotiable. But Norma Jeane also signed away rights to her image. She got $50, and Kelly sold that photograph for the rest of his life, making thousands from her body, while she received nothing beyond initial payment. Perfect metaphor for her entire relationship with fame. She traded everything: name, identity, privacy, sanity, for survival and success. Others got rich off her image, performances, labor. She got fame, which turned out to be its own trap, its own death. The photograph that needed $50 to create has been reproduced millions of times, probably generating millions in revenue. Norma Jeane got $50. The math of exploitation is really that simple. When we look at Marilyn Monroe images now, when we admire her beauty or sexuality or iconic status, we should remember, we're looking at someone systematically destroyed by the process of becoming who we see. We're admiring the result of an erasure. We're celebrating a murder. Not a literal murder, perhaps, though even that remains uncertain. But the murder of Norma Jeane Baker, killed slowly by a system that needed Marilyn Monroe more than it needed a real human being. The world got Marilyn Monroe. Beautiful, famous, immortal. But Norma Jeane Baker, the scared foster kid, the factory worker, the girl who just wanted to be seen and loved for who she actually was, never had a chance. She died long before August 5th, 1962. She died the moment she said yes to becoming someone else, and nobody even noticed she was gone until it was far too late to save her. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, every time you're tempted to trade who you really are for who you think you should be, there's a cost. Make sure you can afford to pay it.